All right, everybody. Welcome to the show. I have got a special treat for you today. I've got Clint Harper backstage. And here's what's funny. Football coach, and we just did a scrimmage run because I just talked to him for about 25, 30 minutes and then realized, oh my God, I hadn't hit record. So we're doing this again. What a great guy that he's going to stay behind and let me fumble F myself through a really bad practice run. But fortunately, he's good natured and we're going to do that. I want to tell you a little bit about Clint Harper and why he's coming on the show and how it's going to relate. Let you know ahead of time, by the way, make sure that you have seen already 2 documentaries. Outcry is one of them, about Greg Kelly, a high school football player who, by the way, Clint Harper was his coach. We're going to talk about that in detail, and there's spoilers to that. So if you haven't seen that documentary, which I extremely recommend you watch, it is an amazing show. And Clint Harper is featured in many episodes, I think at least 2, maybe 3 episodes at some different points in there, giving insight as his coach. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Clint Harper is also going to talk about his podcast that he started. It's a podcast called Wrong Place, Wrong Crime. I'm going to show you a little bit about that in just a second. I'm going to bring him up pretty quickly for like the second time. Anyways, and we're going to talk about his passion, one of his passions, which is the yogurt shop murders in Austin, Texas. We're going to talk about that, how he got into true crime, a lot of different things. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him up early again and bring him on screen. And hey, like, how you doing? It's the first time we've met.
Long time no see.
Oh my gosh. This is why I'm not a professional. I need to have producers. If I had producers, we wouldn't be making this mistake. They would have already worked stuff out with you and they got your sound working and they would have said, go. But
hey, Lee, I'm just telling you, I watch enough. It doesn't matter. I watched enough NFL this Sunday to realize even professional coaches make a whole lot of mistakes. Go and ask the New York Giants about the end of that game and
oh my gosh,
lose a game. So it doesn't matter, whether you're a professional or if you mistakes happen. It happens.
It's funny. I went to WSU just as an aside, and we had a phrase in there about the Cougars being up on a game, and then they somehow managed to snatch defeat out of the claws of victory. Right? They can somehow snatch defeat out of the claws of victory.
I've coached a few of those teams. Yeah, I've heard that. I know that all too well.
It's horrible. So, you and I'm going to tell our audience, you and I met at CrimeCon 2025 in Aurora, Colorado. Yes, I talk really fast, by the way, for those of you who aren't used to me. And there, like I said, I saw you sitting there with a laptop, and I needed a place to sit down with a laptop. I didn't know who you were from Man on the Moon. I sit down, and in 2 seconds after I sit down, you're like, hey, do you mind watching my stuff? I'm going to leave. And you left your laptop and all your gear. And I thought to myself, that dude just left me with all his gear, super trusting, naive, whatever the case may be. I made jokes about it. It's like, what this guy thinking? But you walk me through what you thought about that. Like, you just, what was that?
I am a super trusting person. I really do believe that most people, 99% of the people in this world, I really do believe are good. But I'm also 6'7" and about 270 pounds. So I'm trusting, but I'm also pretty intimidating. And so if you were brave enough to take my stuff and know that I might find you and catch up with you and pummel you.
Right. That's true. I guess there is that factor. It's like, you don't want to screw with that guy. But to be fair, I didn't even realize, because I was like so wrapped into my work when you walked away. I didn't even notice how large of a guy you were until you came back and we shared stories. And I said, you were sitting down and I said, hey, let's take a selfie together. And that's when I realized our size difference. And so, yeah, unfortunately for you, I didn't realize I would have been in trouble if I had stolen your shit. But when you got back, it was all too clear. And by the way, like I cover a case of the Long Island serial killer, Rex Heuermann. I think he's about 6'7".
He is. He's a big fella too. Yes, he is a big, large man.
So now I realize what it would feel like to stand in front of Rex Heuermann. So thanks for that. That actually was a great moment for me to have that moment.
John Wayne Gacy was a big fella too. He was a large man too.
Yeah. So anyways, at CrimeCon 2025, you and I were talking, we both sat in on, what I had said the first go around is I found, and I think you agreed, that CrimeCon 2025 is largely pro law enforcement, pro prosecution. Everything they had is kind of featured towards that. And me being a person in my channel who focuses on the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and I'm critical of mainstream media and even law enforcement at time, although I have friends in law enforcement. I know you work with law enforcement as well. Even though I do that, I was warned, like, hey, I'm not sure you're going to dig CrimeCon because it's like pro law enforcement all the way. But you and I did sit in on a really good kind of wrongful conviction story. Do you remember the guy's name, by the way, the story that they were telling?
I cannot remember that name. I need to go and get my my script. I've got it right over here from CrimeCon. I kept all my stuff, but I cannot remember his name to save my life. But it was an unbelievable story, and I hadn't heard.
And I hadn't heard about it either. And I'll just go off the cuff because we talked a little bit about it before, but I want to talk about it again. The amazing part for me, like, again, most of the CrimeCon is all about, hey, we caught the bad guy, and everybody cheers and claps about how they caught the bad guy. This was one of those, I think it was even perhaps the district attorney or the prosecutor that was giving the speech about the wrongful conviction. I think it was, and it was pretty powerful. The guy was really impressive. And you know, the story basically was everybody was convinced this guy had killed his wife. Her body was found along the side of the road. The car that she was in was stopped on the side of the road. But they even had witnesses that came forward and said, yeah, they heard them fighting. They saw them fighting. They saw him putting something in the trunk. They had all these details that looked like this is a no-brainer. This guy killed his wife and dumped her on the side of the road. Later on, it turns out after he spent a crap ton of time in prison, I think it was it close to 30 years or something?
It was. I think 28. I think was.
Ridiculous amount of time in jail that he'll never get that time back. Anyways, it turned out that somebody else had killed her, just like he had said. It wasn't him, but they had all kinds of people. The jury was, in my opinion, misled by details, by not having them tell certain details that they knew would make it look like exculpatory evidence, I would say, and just kind of hid those. One of the things that was most fascinating, and you and I talked about this before, was for me, it was the body was found quite a ways back from where the car was found. And it turned out that when they found the real killer, the guy who actually did it, and he confessed to the murder, he gave details that only the killer would have known, which was that when he had stopped her and came up to her in the car, she tried to drive away. And he reached in and he threw the car in park, and basically therefore had ruined the transmission, and the car could only drive so much further. So he only got a little ways up the road when the car basically died on him, and he had to pull it over, which explained why the body and the car were so far apart. And as you said, also had moved the seat back because he was a large guy like you, and moved the seat back. And they just kind of failed to mention those details. But when the guy was actually, confessed to it, he knew those details that only the killer could have known. And then out comes this guy who spent 30 years of his life in prison being demonized by everybody for being the guy who killed his wife when it was all wrong. It was all wrong.
Yeah, it's kind of, prosecutors are they're trying to move up the chain. Like I said earlier, being a football coach, you're trying to get W's, and the only way as a football coach you move up the line is you win football games. It's the same thing as a prosecutor. You got to win cases. If you lose a bunch of cases, you're not moving up the ladder. You're never going to be the district attorney or the AG of a state or all the things that you get to be if you win cases. And so that's just the hard reality of life, is they're trying to win, just like football coaches.
Right. And that's a great way for us to segue into the whole Outcry story, which is, and again, that's kind of like when we met, I think you told me, and I hadn't actually heard the story of Greg Kelly. You told me, hey, I said, what are you doing here? What, is this your first time, whatever? And we kind of talked, and you said, yeah. And hey, by the way, did you know, you said, I'm going to do it. You said, I'm retiring from football coaching, and I'm going to do like a true crime podcast. And I'm like, holy shit, like, guess what I'm doing? I'm doing true crime podcasting. So there was that cool moment. And I said, we should do a talk. And then you mentioned, hey, by the way, I happen to be in a documentary called Outcry. Have you ever heard about it? And that's where you and I talked about that for the first time. By the way, did I show your channel on this go around real quick? I want to show that.
Not yet.
Yeah, let's do that real quick. This is Clint Harper's channel on YouTube, and he's just getting started as far as, the subscriber list, although not just getting started. Look at this. He's got 19 videos here. He's got all this stuff. Wrong Place, Wrong Crime podcast. So make sure before you forget, stop everything you're doing for a moment, if you will, and hit subscribe, like, whatever, or jot yourself a note if you have to. Make sure you get this guy's channel on there and give him some love and support. And again, because he's so gracious to come on the show and share his story, we want to make sure he gets something out of it. So try to get him some support and get that channel going and watch what he does. But when we were talking about, your true crime podcast and stuff like that, you talked about how you asked me if I knew about, I think it was the KFC murders and the yogurt shop murders. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You're like, oh, these cases are great. And I have to say, now that I've gone and I've watched, and we will get back very quickly to Outcry, but I've watched the yogurt shop murders, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, we really need to do this show, because once again, This is an issue of potential wrongful convictions, over aggressive policing, prosecution that looks and basically hides from the jury what some of the stuff would have made it look like exculpatory information. Just all those shenanigans that I really get pissed about happened in that case. And again, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched it, the Yogurt Shop Murders is like a 4-part series on HBO that I watched, and really good stuff. This will be spoilers. But let's talk about Outcry. So Greg Kelly was a high school football player that you coached. You said he was, as the show showed, a standout football player above and beyond your other players. Talk a little bit about him, both as a player and as a person.
Yeah, he was a standout safety for us, an unbelievable defensive player. Was going to be able to go anywhere he really wanted to go Division I wise. And that's even before NIL. So he wasn't nowadays he'd been making a lot of money because he was that talented, but he was also, his family is comes from an unbelievable family that runs track. They all run the quarter. He had 2 other brothers. His oldest brother, actually, I believe, was on the Olympic. He was an alternate on the Olympic team. That's how good their family is at track. And so if he not only football, but he would have had a possibility of running track in college. He was a phenomenal athlete, but the thing that I loved about Greg was he was not only a great football player, he was a great human being. He was a fantastic kid, and it made me sick. I'll give you a little bit of background. I had left, as you'll hear in the documentary, I had left to go back to my hometown as the head football coach in Marshall, Texas. And it was an August night. It was a late night. We'd gotten out of a late night practice, and I'm driving home at about midnight, and I just happened to come across TSN, which is the Texas State News Network, and they announced that Leander High School football player arrested for sexual assault of a minor. And I said, oh, my God, I wonder who in the world, one of my players. And then I called around the next morning and found out it's Greg Kelly, and I just could not believe it. I knew right then that was not true. That it just wasn't in Greg's nature. There was
no part of you, right? No part of you thought that's possible, right?
Never doubted. Never ever once in all those years ever thought that Greg had any part to do with this. Never doubted at any point. Never had a second thought or I thought, well, maybe he did do it. Never. I knew.
It's funny because watching him on, I felt the honesty in that kid from the second he's on screen. And I thought to myself, what the fuck? Like, I'm just thinking to myself, how is this even possible? And to be fair, and for the spoilers, there's a moment in the show where you're like, holy shit. Like, how did you, when they ask him about the lie detector thing, there's that moment where they said, well, I passed every single question except for one. And the one he missed, you're like, oh my God, like how did you miss that one? Right. But they pointed out people, when they're under stress, when they're being asked and they're being accused of something, that people, I need to educate people for a moment. All a lie detector test tells you is not whether you're lying on it. It tells you whether you had a physiological response to a question. 100%. It doesn't even tell you why you had that physiological response.
This kid, I hate lie detector tests. I think they can be manipulated one way or the other. I think they can give false, just like that story. And I think good liars can because because like you just said, they don't have any physical. Because they're sociopaths. Yeah. They don't feel any guilt. They don't have any tension about lying. And so, I don't put any trust in lie detector tests.
And look, this is the reason why lie detector tests are not admissible in almost every single case, because they know that they're not accurate. All they can do is help law enforcement come up with a theory, but it's not admissible in court for a reason. Just like you said, a sociopath can pass them because they don't have any consciousness, or a person who's completely innocent can have a physiological response to a question because they're tired of being accused of something that makes them angry, and whatever the case may be. And you cannot stop the body's reaction when they ask you something and you're just like, fuck you, man. Like, and that response is going to set off you're lying about something, you're being deceptive. And now a good person is supposed to be able to, like, okay, we noticed you had a response to the question, and walk you through why you had the response to the question, instead of saying you failed it and therefore you did, it's not an admission of guilt. It's just a physiological response that you're supposed to follow up on. And of course that happened to this individual.
Yeah. And the thing about Greg is, they didn't hit on this a lot in the documentary. I don't even know if they did actually hit this, but they came to him with a plea agreement, and basically they offered him a plea of no time in prison. All he had to do was plead guilty, with no time in prison, but he'd have to be registered as a sex offender the rest of his life. And he said, no, I'm not doing it. I didn't do this. And basically he went for all or nothing. It was going to be 25 years or be set free. And he went to trial knowing that he didn't, but he could have taken the plea and never served any time, but he would have been registered and gone down as guilty, and he was not going to do it. That's just the kind of person and kid he is.
Well, and I have to say, so many cases plea out in this country. Something like 93% or something like that of cases never go to trial because they work and they convince a person that the deck is stacked against them, that you are going to serve hard time, that there's nothing you can do about it. And the best thing you can do for yourself is to take a plea deal and lessen the punishment, whether you did it or not. And it's a personal bug, bee in my bonnet, whatever you want to say, when people say nobody pleads guilty to something they didn't do, because, and it's such horseshit, because they stack the deck against you. They overcharge you. They threaten you with the worst case scenario. And they say, look, you're going down. And so you can plea and you can lessen your time. Some people, thank goodness, don't do this. And again, spoiler alert, it didn't turn out so great with Greg Kelly, right? He decided to fight it, and a jury found him guilty. And he spent time before
3 years in the hardest prison in Texas, in Huntsville. That's the prison of all prisons in the state of Texas. So he served hard time with hardened criminals.
And the worst thing, which they don't mention, not only hardened time, but as a sex offender of a young child. Like, he's going into a prison system where that's like the least popular thing you can be in prison for. If they find out you molested a kid in prison, your days are numbered. You're open season for anything. And so it was a gutsy move on his part to stick to his guns and say, look, I didn't do this, and stand by his guns. And unfortunately, like I said, the system kind of failed him for a while. Fortunately, again, spoiler alert, things get rectified for him eventually, but you can't give him that life back. You can't give him that time back. And there are people, I think even in the episode, they show people who are convinced to this day that he's still the guy, despite the fact that everything to a reasonable, in my opinion, a reasonable person would say that's not the guy. But there's still people who are like, I got to tell you, there's an officer in there, the chief of police, I think is what it was, who basically had attitude of, well, yeah, he's guilty. Nobody else has been accused of it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Your reasoning for he's guilty is nobody else has been accused, so he has to be guilty. Like, when there was just asinine comments that were said in that whole case, I wanted to throw
Greg's from the wrong side of the track. He was, there's really two towns. It's Cedar Park, and that's kind of the well-to-do area. And then there's Leander, and Leander's old ranch farmland, kind of a old school, workers mentality, kind of bootstraps, blue collar worker. And Greg was, we were Leander High, and we were from that side of town. And so unfortunately, as you'll see in the story, he was living with a family because, again, it's an unbelievable story. His mom had gotten cancer. His dad had a stroke, within about a 3 or 4 month period. We were looking for him. He was still obviously needing to go to high school. We found a family for him to live with, and then they lived in the Cedar Park side of town. And this story goes, the craziness of what happened in that house. That's where I feel bad still to this day, because it was, the family came forward and said, hey, we'll help this family out. We'll help raise Greg and let him stay with us. And God knows, now looking back, hindsight being 2020, obviously you go back and you say, no, I'd rather you live with us or live with somebody else. There's just too much stuff going on in that house, which we didn't know at the time, but it's just an unbelievable story of, you talk about things being, the deck being stacked against you. Oh my God. Just,
and I will say, for those, haven't seen it, and hopefully this doesn't ruin you, that show had a lot of back and forth moments where you're like, man, there's no way he did it. And you're like, well, maybe he did. And man, there's no way he did it. And, well, maybe, and they really did a good job of kind of letting you not know for sure. I feel definitively at the end, for sure that kid's not guilty. But so that's that, again, the huge spoiler, but it broke my heart, but also it was touching. And for me, I related to there was a guy in there that they just simply listed as an advocate, some guy that said, this story seems like bullshit to me and I'm going to go fight for Greg Kelly. And my wife kept saying when we were watching that, who is this guy? I'm like, he's me. Like, I'm just like, I see certain stories and I'm like, that's horseshit. That's not what happened. So I hope to be something like this guy where I'm just like, where I can maybe someday help somebody, overturn a wrongful conviction would be a dream of mine. And I think that guy and I just felt connected to him the way he was just a pit bull. And he even said, and this is the same way I feel, at the end of the day, if Greg Kelly is guilty, screw him. Like, I'll have no sympathy for the guy. I don't think it happened and I'm going to fight for the guy. But if he's guilty, then I'll have no sympathy. And that's the same with me. When I'm giving somebody the presumption of innocence, if it turns out they're guilty, so be it. Let the system play out. What I don't want to see is a bad trial, police misconduct, coerced confessions, that kind of shit. Let's convict people correctly and not with coercion and crappy tactics. But
yeah, I hate to give away for the viewers, but it wasn't the police officers that eventually figured out who it really was. It was one of my coaches. And I don't know if they go into that part of the story in the documentary a whole bunch. It's been a while since I watched it, but
I don't think they do.
Coaches went and got, here in Texas, we have what's called a media guide, and all of our football players have their picture. And it is eerily amazing that the kid that he was living with looked exactly like Greg in the picture. And and my coach was the one that finally figured it out and said, hey, you know what? These guys look very, very similar. And it would not be for a 4-year-old to, in the middle of the night, get somebody confused. And so it was really my coaches that figured out who it really was. It wasn't the police. And so that just kind of tells you how
it was crazy how much those kids looked. Yeah, it was crazy how much they looked similar. And again, there's even moments in that documentary where you see a detective use deceptive tactics on a child to get him to finger Greg Kelly for something he didn't do. Even when the kid says, no, it wasn't, he's like, yeah, it was, and leads the kid into giving the answer that they want because they literally have decided who it was.
And Lee, a detective should never do the forensic interview of a 4-year or a minor. Should never. That should be a professional, but they should never. And so they broke protocol the very first, when he interviewed the 4-year-old and pushed the story and pushed the person he wanted. That should have never happened. Anybody that knows anything about law enforcement or how an investigation, when you have a claim of sexual assault, the detective is no part of the questioning. That is done by a professional that knows how to get true information from a child, not a story that they're trying to push on a child. And so it was bad from the very beginning. I mean, like I said, the deck was stacked against him. They had their person, and by God, they were going to get that guilty verdict.
Yeah. And that's the kind of stuff that makes my blood boil. I've seen too many police interrogations, and when they show those kind of things on camera, on a documentary like that, and you see an officer or detective, whatever, leading the witness and telling them, this is what you saw, and now repeat what I just told you saw, I get furious. I'm just like, fuck, like, why are we letting that happen? I'm so mad. But anyways, great show. Do you have anything further to say about Greg Kelly? Have you talked to him at all since the show has been over? You guys have
actually, I contacted him. We're going to meet up in December. I've got a trip, probably here in probably a little over a month. And he contacted me, told me how much he loves me, and wanted to try to get a lunch or a meal with me. And so I think we're going to hook up in December. I'm going to get a chance to catch up with him. He's got a family now. Again, spoilers. That's not going to be on the video. He, just an unbelievable story. His girlfriend stood by him over the whole time. For 3 years he was in prison, didn't move on. She stuck beside him. They're now married. They've got a child. It ended up being an incredible, positive story, but it came from such a bad place. And it's just, again, his character, and the story should really be about how great his character is, which they do. But
I'm an emotional guy, and so I hope I can say this without, because it brought tears in my eyes watching the end of that show.
Everybody I've ever watched, even the hardened person, they watch all 5 of those episodes, and you'll be bawling by the end, because it's just so sad about how the system failed Greg, and we failed we
And
felt,
I loved that moment where I loved the moment where procedurally they weren't going to allow his mom to say a word. And he's like, will you have some decency and let her talk? I was like,
yeah,
it was good. It was good. He's a great man.
the
He was amazing.
lawyer, the family hired the lawyer, and she worked against him to get him found guilty, where they didn't go back and pin it on
Yeah.
the other boy, the family. I mean, it's an unbelievable story that you couldn't write it in Hollywood and people would believe it. They would think it was fiction if you wrote
Yeah.
that story. And it's an incredible story of character and never giving up and just believing that eventually, that people like kind of what we talked about, that the good eventually would win in the end. And that's just Greg in a nutshell.
And before we finish that story, and I don't remember what the amount was. Again, you can never give somebody back their life, lost life, the years that he spent in prison, the ridicule that he spent, the fact that some people are still going to believe probably to this day that he was involved in it. You can't undo that kind of damage. I know he won a settlement. I hope that it was a good enough settlement that his life has been improved and that he's living a good life, because that guy deserved every bit of any dime that they gave him, even though I don't feel like you can give somebody enough money to pay for the damage they did to you. But
in the state of Texas, it rounds out to about between $80,000 to $100,000 for every year you're in prison, if you're exonerated. And that's the thing. Even Yogurt Shop, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, even the guys that spent 10 years in prison, they never exonerated them. And it'll be interesting, as we now have a suspect that they believe actually did it, if the families go back in and file to be exonerated. That way they can collect those 10 years of basically $800,000 for each one of the families.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and again, it's a hefty sum of money to do 80 to 100,000, because some people never make that kind of money, a year. But again, it's at what cost? At what cost? It's just, I don't know. So let's talk about the yogurt shop murders. And like I said, I did watch a 4-part documentary about it before we got together, so that I would get, boned up on it. And it has an amazing story of over policing, wrongful conviction, manipulating the data to try to make it fit so that you can get a conviction, leaning on people for false confessions. Again, people with this narrative, nobody admits to something they didn't do. We know that's not true, but I swear you still can't get people to wake up to the fact that people will admit to things they didn't do because of the tactics that are used. Very, very strong tactics. But would you mind if giving us a summary of the yogurt shop murders and why you got into the case, why this is so interesting to you?
Here's kind of a quick synopsis. 4 girls were in December of 1991, December 6, 1991. 2 of the girls were working. 2 of the girls that were there were helping clean up, and they were going to have a sleepover. The 4 girls were killed that night. The place was set on fire. It's what was called, and the reason it's called Yogurt Shop, they were working in I can't believe it's yogurt store. It's a little yogurt shop, and that they had it in the early 90s here in Texas. And so these girls were working in a yogurt shop. That's hence the reason it's called that. The
High school girls, right?
Yeah, the 4 girls are taken into the back of the yogurt shop. They're each shot at point blank range. And really what kept this from being solved for a lot of years was, again, the criminal was smart enough to understand how to destroy evidence. So he set the back of the shop on fire. So that destroyed a lot of the evidence. And so unfortunately, when the fire department came in, they didn't know that these 4 girls had been killed. They came in to put out a fire. They put out the fire, which the water destroyed pretty much 99% of the rest of the evidence, except just they were able to get some DNA, which is going to be important 33 years later. But pretty much most of the rest of the evidence was destroyed, and it was a gruesome scene. It was awful. The girls had all been sexually assaulted. Again, it was things that some of the police officers and some of the detectives, they'll still say to this day, they think about it and they see it in their minds every day. And so it's just an unbelievable, terrible sight. It goes on for 33 years. 2 weeks after the girls are murdered, they pick up a young man, a 16-year-old named Maurice Pierce in a mall, who's carrying a .22. which was one of the weapons. 2 weapons were used. There was a 22 and a 380 that were used. And they pick him up. He's got a 22 on him. And so they think that they've got their person and that he's involved. The crazy thing about it was they let him go. The first of the original detectives, Detective Jones, doesn't believe that the young men, they had stolen a car the night before, the night of the yogurt shopping, and drove down to San Antonio, like what a person that had just killed 4 people. They're just joyriding in a stolen car, which again doesn't make any sense. That's one of the whole reasons I never believed if you committed a crime, you're not going to be joyriding around in a stolen car trying to get caught. And so their stories never made any sense. They let them go, and it was 8 years later when another detective came onto the case by the name of Hector Polanco. They brought these 2 young men in, really to me, the 2 weakest ones that they knew were not the sharpest tools in the shed. I hate to say that, but they knew who the weakest links were. They brought them in and they interrogated them for hours and hours on end. And they got 2, as we know now, 2 false confessions.
Yeah. And, there's so many things to talk about. One, I want to point out, like you said, there's that moment for you, and it's just in what apparently got you interested in the story that happens to me in a lot of stories, is there's that moment where your bullshit detector goes off. There's no way those kids are going out joyriding after doing this or whatever. And so there's that moment where you're like, something's wrong with this case. And why is it that there's so many people that don't ask that question, and why people like you and I will be like, wait a minute, that makes no sense. And we start looking deeper. But
and I was literally 5 days away from turning 16 myself. So I've grown up with this case. This was, of course, it made Texas news immediately the next morning. And like I said, I was about to turn 16 and get my driver's license. And of course, your mom and your family, they hear that story and they start worrying about you driving around and being out late at night and things like that. And so I grew up with this story since the day it happened. And that's why I've always been fascinated with it. And I've spent 33 years trying to keep up with it. And of course, 48 Hours Mystery has been great about that, which you'll see in the documentary. Aaron Moriarty, which I got to meet at CrimeCon, kind of my hero, was on it. Nice. Really from the very first or second day of it happening, because they had a CBS film crew that was doing a story there about murders in Austin. And so they were there literally on the scene that night videoing. And so she's been involved for over 30 years in it. First thing she told me was that she always knew that the 4 boys weren't involved. That she knew that, which most people did. If you had common sense and you weren't trying to push an agenda, you pretty much knew that those 4, again, just the things that would have a criminal and somebody with the background would have had to carry this out. And again, let me give you a little bit.
I'm not sure where to go. I want
back, and they spent 40 minutes torturing and doing things to these girls that a 16-year-old boy who's never committed a crime would not be thinking about doing. They're going to do what they got to do and get out of there.
Yeah.
This person, whoever it was, which we now know who it was very methodical, and like I said, just did things to these poor girls that it was you wouldn't even want to think about what happened in those 40 minutes.
Once again, what you're pointing out is your bullshit detector goes off. You're like you said, there's no way a 16-year-old kid who's never committed murder before is doing and taking the time that logically in your mind, this doesn't make sense. And yet law enforcement in this case, went a little full, and it's like they leaned on Maurice Pierce, right? It's like they couldn't put him at the scene. So they leaned on him and said, tell us a story that we can use. Oh, well, I loaned my gun to some other kid and he disappeared and came back and said I did it. Okay, good. Can you testify? It's like testify to that in court and we'll go after this other guy. And it's just, it makes you sick. It's like they want a conviction so bad that they'll take a guy who was probably the prime suspect at the time, Maurice, the prime suspect, and basically let him walk on on being the main guy saying, give us something. Oh, well, I gave my gun to some other kid and he went away for a while. And then he came back and said he did these horrible things and wasn't me. Don't look at me. And they use that. And then, like you said, they oftentimes find the weak elements and put pressure on them. And the hard part for people to understand and believe is when you hear somebody say, and they sign a piece of paper, right? They sign a piece of paper. I did this crime and I whatever. You're thinking there's no way you can do this. But let me try to explain real quick a little bit of how this works. And it's shown in the documentary. They interrogate you for hours after hours after hours, saying you're being dishonest. You're just not remembering it right. Isn't it true that this happened? And then after hours and hours, at one point, the guy said, I just wanted to get out of the room and be able to get an attorney or whatever. So at some point I'm telling them what they want to hear so I can get out of there. But then they can turn that on you and say, well, you just told us this. Are you going to be a liar and go back on your own word? You said this. So now admit that you did that because you said and they just keep working you to the point that you're signing a piece of paper saying, yeah, I did all these things. And unfortunately, there's a lot of freaking dumb people who are like, well, yeah, he did it because he signed his name to it. Nobody would do that if they didn't do it.
Yeah, it's like I talked to you about earlier, Lee. There are people that are talented. Like we talked about, I kind of compared it to you earlier. There's people that are very talented at selling timeshares. That's what they're called, high pressure salesmen. That's what they do. They sell you on buying something that you really don't need to buy or want to buy, but by the end of the time you leave there, you're buying it, and you've spent thousands and thousands of dollars that you don't have. And it's the same thing with a detective that's very good at pressuring you and getting you to say what he wants you to say. And so I have no doubt that they deprive you of water, they deprive you of food, they keep you there for hours. It is no doubt
wear you down, and
Austin PD knew it, and you said it earlier in our discussion. Good cops don't like bad cops, and there were a lot of people on APD that knew how Polanco was and really didn't want anything to do with him, and didn't appreciate the way that he questioned people and the way that he handled cases. And you can hear that in the documentary. You can kind of see Detective Jones was not a fan of his at all.
Right. And this is, I'm glad you brought up Polanco again, because again, he was pointed out as having this great, amazing track record. If he went after you, he got convictions all the time. He had, and I always think to myself again, well, that's something we need to look into, because it's not that he's just that lucky. He's doing something to coerce people, to lean on them, to convince them that they have no choice, that they're going down. It's that kind of stuff that worries me. Anytime I see a DA who has a crazy prosecution record and always gets convictions, I start looking into what is he doing. I mean, I've got another case where in the Rex Heuermann case, where the DA had basically leaned on somebody to get a false confession so they could put somebody away for something. And it was just known that's what he did. He had a great track record, and he moves up the ladder and he gets promoted because he makes arrests and he gets his guys, but not always legitimately, unfortunately. And this system, and by the way, there was for those who haven't seen it, there's moments in that show that really bothered me where, how do I explain it? Where the judge, for example, or the prosecutor will try to explain that I don't think I'm a bad guy. Like I'm trying to like, it's like they say, I did this thing that really doesn't look good on paper, but technically it's legal and it's the law. And I thought I was doing the right thing. And it's like, it's hard because the system itself is set up to fail people. The system is designed in a way that can be manipulated. And so if you're a rule player, you can almost say, you understand why they allow it to happen, but I don't know if I'm making any sense, but there was just those moments, you know what I'm talking about?
It definitely does. Like I said, it's, our court system's run by humans, and humans make mistakes and they have agendas, and if we weren't human, if it wasn't run by humans, I would think it might be perfect, but as long as it's being run by humans, there's going to be mistakes, and it's going to be people that have agendas that are trying to do things for their own personal benefit. It's just the way human nature is. And so, it was, of course, I did this. I started that story in January, having no idea that they were doing a documentary. HBO was doing a documentary. It's just something I've always wanted to, and I had a suspect. If you watch the podcast, I had a suspect that I thought was very, very, it was a strong candidate or suspect for the case. It was a guy by the name of Kenneth Allen McDuff, who was a serial killer who actually, it's amazing, but that small town of Austin, Texas had two of the worst serial killers in the month of December of 1991 walking its streets. You had Kenneth Allen McDuff, who kidnapped a lady by the name of Colleen Reed on December the 29th, 3 weeks after Yogurt Shop from a car wash. And he changed our penal system here in the state of Texas. But the way we do paroles, he's the only person in Texas history, and maybe in United States history, I'm not sure, he was on death row twice. He had killed 3 people in 1966, was put on death row. Of course, the Supreme Court overruled the death penalty in the 70s, and so he was commuted to a life in prison. And then in 1989, our state of Texas didn't want to spend money on building new prisons, so we just started letting out prisoners, thousands of them a week. And a 3-man parole board really didn't look at the case very well and didn't do a background on this guy. He was known as the broomstick killer, and they just released him. And he ends up killing over 10 more women, one of them being Colleen Reed there in Austin. And so to me, he was always a strong suspect. And and as you'll hear, there's still never been a definitive why they ruled him out. And they really didn't even have him. The crazy thing about law enforcement, and even especially in the early 90s and 80s, they didn't talk with one another. So he was killing women. He was killing women in Waco, and Waco didn't even know that they had a woman that had been kidnapped down in Austin because they just didn't communicate. We didn't have the internet. And so it's an incredible story that this small little Austin town, as we now know, the true killer was another serial killer that had come into Austin on December 6th. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers. And that is who the suspect is now that they have put the Yogurt Shop on because of DNA and actually because of a gun match. And so it's just incredible to think there were 2 serial killers, 2 of the worst serial killers in U.S. history, that were walking this same little town within the same month.
Yeah. And I'm all over the place with so many things I want to say about this show. Like with the Yogurt Shop murders, they talk about some of the little manipulation tactics they use on the jury. For example, like they could talk about, the gun that was used, and they talk about Maurice's gun, and the prosecutors know that was not the gun that was used in the crime. And yet they misled the jury into thinking you handed him this gun and then he went and committed these murders. It wasn't even the same gun. That wasn't the gun that was used at the crime, but they just kind of like not mention that part for the jury, that they and allow the jury to think you gave him the gun and then you went and committed murders.
Yeah. He had 22 on him. And so that was, that's all they said was, well, he was caught with a 22 2 weeks later. Well, they never said whether the gun was tested or which it was, and it was proven that it wasn't the weapon that was used. But they didn't mention that. They just mentioned that he had been found with a 22, which was accurate.
This is a prime example of what I was telling you when I said there was these moments where they make it. Somebody says, well, I didn't lie. Like when the prosecutor or whatever is talking about that moment where they said, this is the gun, whatever. He's like, I didn't technically lie. I didn't say it was the gun committed in the crime. I just said, this is the gun Maurice gave you. Right. And so he's even trying to justify himself that, you're misleading people with it. And you're still somehow justifying it with yourself. Like, well, I didn't actually say it was the gun used in the crime. I didn't lie and say it was you. If you made that an inference, that's on you. And I'm like, that's such horseshit way of dealing with it in a way. I was kind of irritated about that, but
And I don't know. What I talked to you about earlier, Lee, and I want to make this point because people are going to watch, they're going to watch YouTube and they're going to see, they solved the Yogurt Shop case. They did solve the Yogurt Shop case in one aspect. And if you really get into my episodes, I actually did an episode in one of I believe it was episode 6, I believe. It was called 2 Men in a Booth. This case, the Yogurt Shop, has always, from day one, people always thought it was multiple people. That's why they thought there was multiple boys. And the reason it always goes back to that, Lee, is at 10:42 that night, and let me be specific because I want to make sure everybody understands this is not a theory. This is eyewitness testimony. This is not something that Clint came up with, or this is not a theory of who it was. At 10:42 that night, two witnesses by the name of, let me make sure I get their names right.
Yeah.
Margaret Stryker and Tim Sheehan. They walked into the yogurt shop at 10:42 to get some yogurt. Margaret sees two men in a booth. These two men in the booth were sitting right next to the register. She feels awkward. She doesn't feel comfortable. She actually doesn't want to leave the girls there. And so she sits down in the booth right next to the two men in the booth. And she's trying to overhear what they're talking about. They're whispering. And Mr. Stryker, he sees the girls. The girls start cleaning up the store. They're closing. It's only like 10, 15 minutes before the 11 o'clock, the store is going to close. He basically says, let's go ahead and leave. That way these girls can get the store cleaned and they can get out of here. So they leave at 10:47. Jennifer walks behind them and locks the door, which is the same key that was later found. And she turns over the sign to close. So that was the last customers of the night. But those two men were still in that yogurt shop. And
wow,
so
yeah.
I don't want, I'm so glad that they found one of the people were that committed these crimes. But again, I don't want us to overshadow and overlook. There were two men in that store that night.
Right. And they've got one, but there's still another.
We can rewrite history and forget that these two witnesses ever existed, but they didn't. It's been their testimony since that night, the next day, that they saw two men in that yogurt shop when they left at 10:47.
And there's another element I want to point out about the cash register, because again, there was a robbery element of this, right? There was a cash register robbery. And what bothered me a lot is when they're getting the false confessions, the coerced confessions from the two individuals that they got confessions from, they asked them details. Well, how much money did you take? They were completely wrong. They didn't, because they didn't do it. They lied. They didn't lie. They made up under duress I think it was $1,000 something. And it's like, that wasn't even close.
That was way over what it really was, because the yogurt shop didn't have that much business, but they didn't know that. And so,
right. And I would say neither did they care that they were wrong about it. They like the prosecution didn't care that they were wrong. And it should lead you to go, well, maybe these guys didn't do it. They're wrong about the dollar amount, or they were wrong about several details. And they just kind of like, well, let's just not mention to the jury that they got wrong the dollar amount that was taken, because that would make it look bad, like they didn't do it.
And they wanted to make it look. And if you study this case very quickly, you realize this was not, yes, the till was taken, and there was around $500, I believe, close to $500 that was taken somewhere. I believe close to that. That may have been the max. But this was a sexual crime. This was somebody that came in and they were going to sexually assault these girls, if not kidnap them from that store, because they had a safe in the back, which they didn't go into detail. They had a safe in the back where the girls had their coats and their other stuff. And that safe was not touched, and the key was sitting right beside the register. So this wasn't a crime where they came in the robbery and the robbery went bad and these girls were shot because it was a robbery that went bad. It's was
more like a sexual crime that turned into something that's taking passion away out.
It was someone who had a sexual motive. Again, it goes back to, this was not 16-year-olds that came in to rob a place and it was a crime of passion and something went wrong. This was a hardened criminal that knew exactly what they were doing, had served time in prison, had been around hardened criminals, knew how to get rid of evidence. All the things I talk about is exactly what Robert Brashear ended up being. He had been a criminal. He had been charged with sexual crimes in the past. He had attempted to kill a woman, had been in prison, and had been paroled in 1989 also. It's, again, I hit a lot of the things. I nailed it on a lot of the things, just didn't get the name right. But it was awesome. It was a case that I'm so glad, again, for the families to know that there is somewhat closure, but I hate that we're going to wrap it up in a nice, neat bow, but I don't believe. I still got to go back to what the eyewitnesses saw that night, and there were two men in that booth. And so
Yeah.
And again, I talked to you, Lee, about why he was in Austin. If you know anything about our interstate system, he had stolen on November the 29th, 1991, Brashears had stolen a car in Georgia. In Georgia, he was heading to he was going to Arizona through El Paso to see his father. And that's a straight shot down I-20. He had no business being anywhere near Austin, Texas. That is almost like 10 hours out of the way. And he was later captured in El Paso 3 days after, or 2 days after, December 8th, he was captured. And since he was a previous felon, he had a gun on him. He had the 380 on him, and that's what he was put back in prison for, was for having a gun. But I believe personally, I think he met somebody in Austin that he knew either from the prison system or somebody. I think they went to this yogurt shop, and I think him being the lead person, I think they ended up, two people, him and a buddy, ended up killing these girls that night. That's my personal theory.
And it's in the coercion and and again, like you said, those guys weren't really exonerated. The charges were dismissed, and that's a difference. But they weren't exonerated. It wasn't that people are. Here's the difference. It's not that people are saying you didn't do it. It's like, well, we didn't get you correctly, so we're going to go back and try and get you correctly. It leaves the specter over their heads for the rest of their life. That they're still guilty, but you just got off on a technicality because somebody violated your civil liberties, and it's not as good as the exonerated. Like, you didn't do it, and we owe you money because we robbed you of your life. I wanted to point out another thing, a couple more things about it. Is there was a moment in the show, spoiler again, I mean, all of this is spoiler. I hate how things are manipulated for juries. There was a discussion about the fire that was set in that back of that room. And there was, and they believed it was clear the fire was set on the shelves. There was some shelving that was lit on fire. And they talk about the V mark of where the flames, it very clearly shows where the fire started. And literally the prosecution got somebody from a fire department to come in and say, okay, look.
To come in and
an arsonist and said, is there any possibility that the fire could have started on the girls and then moved to the wall? And all he said was, okay, I can come up with a scenario in which that could have happened. And that was good enough. Good enough that the girls were set on fire and the fire spread to the wall, even though they knew damn well the fire started on the wall. It didn't start on top of the girls. That kind of shit makes me angry so much.
And what they didn't get into the documentary, again, these weren't super, these aren't Rhodes Scholars. These young men that were brought in. And one of the key things that these young men never had the vocabulary, they kept, all of a sudden they started using the word accelerant, which he had no clue what the word accelerant meant. But all of a sudden, because Polanco started using that word, all of a sudden now he's got an accelerant that he put on these girls, which was never shown to be proven or true at all. And so
again, another detail that wasn't true. He confessed to doing something that the details they know weren't true. Like that accelerant wasn't used. And he said, well, I used this to light the bodies on fire. And they know it's not true. That didn't fit the crime, but somehow they still went ahead with the conviction. It baffles the mind. It baffles the mind, unfortunately, and again, I just want to kick people when they do the whole, nobody admits to something they didn't do. No. You need to start waking up America on how many false confessions and plea deals are done.
Yeah. We've seen it in all the big cases nowadays, not only lead to, we live in a different world nowadays. Not only are there false confessions, but because of social media and our 15 minutes of fame, people want their fame, whether they did something or not. They'll confess to it just where they can get notoriety, and they can get, they can become famous by you saw it in John Bonet. What was it, 5-10 years ago, when the gentleman came forward that ended up confessing that didn't end up having anything to do with it. So it's not only bad confessions, but you'll get confessions nowadays just for. I have no doubt that people confess not only because they're being coerced and being forced, but nowadays they'll do it just for the fame in their 15 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to, I have a case I could elaborate on that but I don't want to necessarily. But you're right. Like there's a scenario. Do you want to go back to being the guy that nobody gave a shit about? You were the guy that was just wrongfully convicted, or the guy that everybody knows your name and will know your name for the rest of history because you're the infamous so-and-so killer and you did this horrific thing. And there are people who will be like, you know what? Everybody will know my name. Whether I did it or not, at least I'm somebody. I did something, even if you didn't, because you'd rather be that guy than the guy that nobody gives a shit about it because you were, it was somebody else.
Go back to 1963. Look at all the people that have confessed that they killed John F. Kennedy over the years.
Right, because you've been this forever.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, it's not a new thing, but today obviously you get so much more notoriety and clicks and your 15 minutes of fame if you you can get on the news. That's why personally, even as a school security person, I don't believe that we should ever publish the person's name. I don't think we should give them the notoriety that these mass shooters, the one in actually there in Aurora and people like that, I don't think we should ever say their name, because that defeats the purpose of why a lot of these folks do these things, is because they want the notoriety nowadays. They want their name to become infamous.
You know, you hit on I can halfway go with you on that, halfway, and I'll tell you why only halfway. Part of me wants to have way more openness and transparency and not hide details, including the names or whatever. So but I understand what you're saying. Giving the name gives that person notoriety, and then, do people commit crimes because they know their name will be a household name and everybody will know who they are. So that's that element for sure. I guess the answer would be, if we trusted the system, let's not know their name and trust that a jury of your peers is going to get the details and that they will convict correctly. But my problem is that I feel like our system is broken and it's failing us. And so I would like to have personally more transparency in our entire system, so the entire country can watch these trials and go, that's horseshit. Like, we all watched it. I don't care what the jury, yes, we have to trust the jury's decision, but I feel like open transparency is the way to go. We have too much that's hidden in this country, where the trial happens in private. Most of the time they don't even go to trial. They plea out and we never even see a trial, which drives me nuts in the case of Bryan Kohberger's case, for example, where a lot of people don't think Kohberger did that crime, but we'll never know because there will never be a trial. He pled guilty. It's end of story. And I'm like, if that thing went to trial, they would have been in big trouble. It was a circumstantial case, but we'll never know because he pled. How many times are we getting robbed in America of knowing what really happened because we have a overzealous system that stacks the deck against you, convinces you you're going down, and then you take a plea deal to avoid a harsher penalty, and you may or may not have done it. And
I was really shocked in that case that they did all of that for all of those years, or year and a half, 2 years almost, that they fought 2.5 years, nailed to plea. I was really shocked. I was driving home from a clinic or a conference when I heard that come across the news, and I was kind of taken back that he actually pleaded. I thought sure that was going to trial. Of course, now they've talked about how he didn't want his sister to have to testify and a bunch of other things. But yeah, that was definitely I'll
tell you this, Clint. I followed that case heavy, and I'll tell you this. I was in the courtroom. I was literally in the courtroom when he changed his plea after 2.5 years, and it was the most surreal moment when the judge said, I want you to understand, when he's talking to Kohberger, I want you to understand what the prosecution would have had to have proven to make you guilty. Mm-hmm. And I want you to hear from them what they would have shown in trial. And they literally said, we can't place him at the house. We don't know how he picked the victims. We don't know why he was there. We can only place him near the house. And that was our case. And I'm looking at him like, and you're gonna take this deal? You're gonna plea? They literally told you we can't place you at the house. And yet today, all people talk about, they had his DNA, they had him dead to rights. And I'm like, you didn't hear the prosecutor. The prosecutor literally said, we can't place him in the house. We can only place him near the house. And it baffles the mind. After 2.5 years that ended in a plea, that I was excited for that to go to trial, because I thought big shit was going to happen when that goes to trial, and we've all been robbed. And we can speculate all day long about why he pled, one of which is he could be guilty. Let's just put it on the table. He could be guilty. I think there's way more to that story. I think as more comes out, it gets worse and worse. That story gets worse as the time goes by. But I want to point out one more thing before we wrap up, because it's been a good solid hour.
I've never seen this in another case, Lee. Maybe, and I've watched and studied true crime and crimes a lot. I have never seen ever them destroy a crime scene or a house before the trial. That way, because most of the time you see OJ, you see most jurors and juries are going to go to the crime scene at some point during the trial. And so that's another thing that just my jaw hit the ground the day that I heard, oh, they demolished or they destroyed the house that the crime happened. And I go, what in the world? Why in the world would you do that? Just keep the house up, Why would you destroy the crime scene before the trial?
Everyone I know has a problem with that. Even people who think he's guilty say, yeah, it was really weird that they tore the house down. There's no way you wouldn't want a jury to walk through that house and 100%. Prove that it could have been done in the time that they said it. The only way to prove it can be done in the time they said, there's 8 minutes. They said this guy killed 4 people on 2 floors. The only way to do that is to have people walk through it and see it for themselves and get the acoustics and know what the survivors could have heard and couldn't have heard. That tearing that house down makes no sense.
It never made any sense to me. I know you followed the case. I never really heard any reasoning other than, I don't know, I guess they traumatized people on campus.
Yes. But, their reasoning was it was going to be, an eyesore, that students would be traumatized walking past the house every single day.
They'd have been a lot more traumatized if he would have gotten found not guilty, but like you said, which could have happened, if they don't. Right. Again, my bit of understanding was the sheath and the little bit of DNA they found if they don't have that, I don't know if they ever really, if that's going to be like you said, that would have been a hard case to prove without that.
It would have been an extremely hard case.
Definitely. I think that would have swayed a lot of the jurors, which nowadays, DNA, because we watch so many TV shows, and that's the CSI, and all of us wrapped up a case in 30 minutes to an hour because of DNA. It was a strange case. There's no doubt about it. I've watched all the datelines and everything else, but that was the one thing to me that besides the plea, I was shocked that he pled, especially after they destroyed the crime scene. And that was it was a weird one. It definitely was.
It literally keeps me up at night sometimes. The things that don't add up in that story. And the worst part about it is, in my belief, I'll just be brief. In my belief, it didn't happen the way that they said it happened, and it's very likely that more than one person was involved in the murders, which means somebody walked for murder.
And that bothers me. Same thing with you, Lee. Now, me and you agree on that. I truly believe he did do it, but I believe that he had somebody there that either drove the vehicle, kind of like OJ. I think OJ did it too, but I believe that he wasn't in that Bronco that night by himself. I think he had somebody that drove him there. I think, again, I always have had that same suspicion that, I would have liked for it to go on the trial just to be able to hear.
Because it bothers me that somebody who is guilty gets to walk and it will never face their day for what they did. That's the part that bugs again. And there's still, in my head, there's still a scenario in which Kohberger didn't do it. But I've always said too, as well, that it's kind of likely to me that Kohberger was involved, but he wasn't the only one. And that bothers me to this day that we won't ever get to know what really happened.
Now, there's no doubt. It's kind of like what I'm doing right now, my season 2. If you watch Wrong Place, Wrong Crime, the season 2 that I'm doing over a case called the KFC murders, which happened here in East Texas. They for years thought that, again, and I think you see this in law enforcement. I know we kind of talked about this at CrimeCon. I think sometimes I have 2 theories. I have a theory that sometimes we get these big cases where you have these mass murders or you have these multiple murders. And nowadays the notoriety becomes so big and you have so many people that get their hands involved in it and that want, to get their piece of it. But back in the 80s, when this happened, you had so many people, you have 5 people that were killed at a little restaurant in East Texas and are found in an oil field. And now you've got multiple jurisdictions. You've got a PD that's working where the restaurant is, and now you've got the sheriff that's working where the crime scene is, 15 miles away. And what I talked about, the communication and law enforcement, there's definitely there's things in law enforcement where there's a lot of ego and there's a lot of things where, it's not all kumbaya and what you see on TV shows that all police work together and we're all in this together. There's a lot of egos and a lot of people and, and if you study this case, the KFC, these people, they actually had to bring in the DPS because these two agencies couldn't get along. And
yeah, I mean, and you know, you hit on it earlier. I mean, a lot of these agencies are stovepiped. They don't talk to each other. They don't communicate. That's been the history of, you know, one department doesn't, you know, different cities certainly don't share their information with each other. And even within the same, you know, basic jurisdiction, they don't share if they're different agencies. And that still goes on. Just real briefly, in the shooting of Brian Thompson, allegedly Luigi Mangione, there literally was a huge article in like the Atlantic or some major magazine where they were talking about the police commissioner was desperate in New York City to try to beat the feds to getting to the guy. And there was a competition. They were literally racing to see who was going to get the credit for catching them. And so they're not working with each other, and they're not trying to get to the bottom of it. They're literally trying to beat each other to the scoop and the arrest, which makes it really like sketchy, you know.
And this has been going on since the 70s. You know, probably one of the most intelligent serial killers, Ted Bundy, realized a long time ago. That's why he killed women in different jurisdictions in different places, because he knew that law enforcement would not work with one another and would not communicate, that they had cases that were very similar and they just weren't going to work with one another. That's why he did that. That's why he moved around so much. He went from Colorado to Utah to Washington to Oregon. That's why he never, you know, because he wanted the law enforcement to communicate, which they didn't. And that's why he went, you know, undetected for so long. And so it's been like that for a long, long time. And in this case that I'm working on now, not only was it obviously a huge story and you had people that were having a hard time working together, but you also, and I think sometimes in these cases, and you saw it there in Yogurt Shop, and you see it sometimes in these cases, they get a suspect and they lock in on that suspect. And I don't want to give away season 2, but it's pretty crazy that they locked in on a drug dealer in Kilgore, and it's a crazy deal about how they locked in on him. They found a fingernail on one of the victims, and when they brought in this suspect to talk to him about where he was that night, he had a fingernail that had been broken off, and so that automatically put the detective that this guy did it. And they got an indictment. They got an indictment. He was going to go to trial, and it just happened to work out. Again, I don't want to give too much you'll need to watch season 2, but it ended up being the fingernail of one of the victims. It didn't end up being this gentleman's fingernail. And so he was, of course, had to be exonerated and let go. And the crazy thing about it, because they were so laser focused on him from pretty much the first week on, that they had the two guys that actually ended up doing it. They had eyewitnesses, and they had been captured in another robbery 3 days later. So it's a crazy case about how sometimes law enforcement can get laser focus, and they get a suspect, and by God, they're gonna let the evidence, and they're gonna get their conviction.
And I have to say, let me caveat this again to say, I'm not anti-law enforcement. I believe good cops are great. And so let me caveat that. But unfortunately, what I would say is, I think it's more often than we want to admit that cops become laser focused. Their job is to develop a suspect and make an arrest. And at that point, they turn it over to the prosecution, and the prosecution's job from that point forward is to prosecute the person who has been arrested. Yep. And unfortunately, the system is designed as such that they really don't want alternative suspects at any point. They make an arrest, and then their job is to get a conviction on the person that's been arrested for it. And alternate suspects, other theories, just muddy the waters. They make it harder to get a conviction, and that's not what the game's about. It's about getting that conviction of the person who's been arrested. So unfortunately, our system is designed to kind of be a little early on making a jump to a conclusion, and then going after with full force to prosecute the person that you believe was the one. On sometimes, and I feel like it happens more often than not, that they grab somebody and then that's who you go after, and you just kind of ignore any other story other than that's who we're going for.
And I'll lead in with this, especially on these big cases here in both Yogurt Shop, as you'll see, even in the documentary, they talked about it. They had at that point in the early 90s, Austin was couple of 100,000 people. It was not a large town. So they had a limited resources and number of cops, and they're getting thousands of tips per day. Well, who's going to work? Who's going to track down all these tips, and who's going to do all this legwork that's got to be done on every one of these tips that's coming in? And so you get outmanned on a lot of these big cases. Same thing happened in KFC, as you're going to find out. And you watch season 2, they've got all these tips coming in, and there's just not enough manpower, and you end up missing something. They didn't in Yogurt Shop because Brashears had never even been on anybody's radar, which was the crazy thing about it. They didn't even know anything about him, had never been a suspect, had never even been mentioned in the Yogurt Shop in 33 years, which was the crazy thing about it. But again, we just I think sometimes you get overwhelmed. You have a hard time, again, kind of going back to what I was talking about. You have a hard time working with one another and communicating, which is always a problem. And when you're doing any kind of investigation or you're having to work with somebody, you got to communicate. And then sometimes you get overwhelmed. It happens in life. You get too big. The task becomes too big for what you're trying to do, and how much there's only so many hours in a day and so many people to do it. So.
Yeah. And so in that regard, some of it can be excused. They literally they don't have enough resources to fight it properly. And the system has got flaws. I hope that we can find ways to, in my opinion, to reform the system a little bit, make it better. Real quick, Clint, before we go, I want to mention again your channel, Wrong Place, Wrong Crime. I don't know why I stumble on that. It's like a mouthful for me, but for everybody who watched this, if you liked Clint, if you liked hearing what he had to say and you want to hear more from him and see, as you can see, his mind is like my mind. He sees things, he hears things. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. And he starts going down that rabbit hole. And that's what I do as well. I think that he's got a similar mind. I think you will dig that show. So make sure you like, subscribe, give him some love on this channel over here. Clint, I want to thank you for coming on, and especially for weathering the storm on the scrimmage play that we did before to kind of practice and get warmed up, and 20 minutes in go, crap, I didn't hit record. So
well, Lee, I sure do appreciate you letting me be on. There's 2 things I love to talk about in this life. I'm really good at one of them, and that's football. I was a really, really good football coach and really good offensive coach. I coached a lot of good quarterbacks. So I'm a really good football coach. I like to talk football, and I like to talk true crime. And so if you can get me on one of those 2 topics, I can talk for hours on either one of those 2. So I sure do appreciate you letting me come on and just talk a little true crime with you. I sure do appreciate being on the Devil's Advocates.
As a close, do you watch a lot of NFL?
I do. This is the first time in all of my years, because most people don't know this is not
busy,
Friday
right?
Night. Yeah, Friday Night Lights, and the TV show and the movies, you get to see the coach, and he's got with his family at 5:00 and he's eating dinner with them. And that ain't the way real life works, folks. Not here in the state of Texas. Texas high school football coaches, in those 14 weeks that you're working, it's Sunday through Sunday. It's 7 days of work, and you're up there. You go to church and you get there at 1:00 and you're there pretty much to 10:00 at night, and you get up, and Monday's the same all the way to Saturday after the game. You work Saturdays. It's a 7-day-a-week job. It's not and so I did that for 30 years. So this is my first year to actually get an open Sunday where I can watch NFL and just relax. And so I have a fantasy league and a fantasy team.
Nice.
It's a great life.
I was going to ask you. I was going to ask, with your expert opinion, I don't know if you've had enough time to watch enough tape, but what you think what my Seahawks look like this year. I think they got a really good team and they're looking solid. But
yeah, here you go, Lee. I think you really got a championship type of team. But here's the honest opinion. I was cussing your coaches the other night on Sunday night. That Texans team had no business being on the field with y'all. That was one of the poorest coaching jobs I've ever seen. Why are you throwing the ball in the 4th quarter up by 15 with 6 minutes left? That team hasn't moved the ball on y'all the entire game. The only way they were going to win that game is if you turned the ball over and gave them a short field, which is exactly what they did. And the reason I'm cussing was because the guy I'm playing in fantasy league had Houston's running back Marks, and who, of course, catches the touchdown pass at the very end? Marks. And so I am cussing the Seahawks coaches like nobody's business at 12. And again, it's 12:30 at night. Why are they playing these Monday night games at 9:00 at night? And so I think the Seahawks really do. You know, Sam Darnold's a fantastic quarterback. They got great weapons around him. I think they've got to run the football a little bit better when it gets to be cold weather in the NFL, because it's going to happen in January. Defense is phenomenal. They got to make better decisions as far as I talk about it all the time. It's game management and clock management. And I know an NFL coach, and I ribbed him on Monday. I said, can the Broncos or can the Giants and the Seahawks get a game and clock manager to talk to their head coach at some point in the fourth quarter about how to manage a game and when to run the ball and when to take a knee and when to do stuff? Because those are the worst game managed games I've ever witnessed as a football coach.
I hear you.
It ended up, it cost the Giants. It cost them that game, and it dang sure almost, if the Seahawks don't get that personal foul, if the Texans don't get that personal foul, the Texans are about to get that ball back with a little over a minute left, and they probably go down and score the way they were going. So it's a crazy game, but no, Seahawks are really good. They really are. That's the first time I gotten a chance to watch them all 4 quarters. Very impressive football team.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for taking your time. And I'm glad you had some positive, I mean, with your expert eye in football, you know what you're looking at. So it's good. It's encouraging to hear if we can get a clock manager, or a game manager, I should say, that doesn't make poor decisions, then maybe we'll be great. But thank you so much for your time. Thanks for weathering that
ball in midfield. I was yelling, just hold on to the ball, for God's sake. Don't give them the ball back. And then they throw an interception, the very next one down there. I was so mad. Oh, yeah. I don't cuss much, but I was cussing that night because, of course, it happens to be the fantasy guy. The one guy that I can't have score for the Texans ends up being the guy that scores and cost me the fantasy game. So it was a disaster.
Well, that's disappointing for your fantasy league. I'm sorry about that. So in the future, maybe we can talk again in the future as you build your channel and you get into things, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk again. I really appreciated having him on. I hope you get some subscribes out of this and some new followers. And it was awesome meeting you at CrimeCon, and thanks for coming on this show tonight.
Thanks, Lee. I tell you what, if the Seahawks make the Super Bowl, you're going to have me back on, and I'll give you a breakdown of whether they can beat looks like the Chiefs, because I think that's who's going to end up coming out of the AFC. So
of course, that sounds like a deal. I'll remember that. I'll keep that in my back pocket.
I'll be done with season 2 by then, and we can talk a little Super Bowl. So thank you so much, Lee, for having me on. Thank y'all.